By evaluating these different bases of power, you should ultimately be able to assess your own levels of positive, negative, and normative leverage in the negotiation, as well as the positive, negative, and normative leverage of your counterpart. And these assessments of the counterpart are equally important because what we ultimately want to assess is how you compare on each source of leverage relative to that counterpart. As I noted earlier, power is a relative phenomenon. Thus, to the extent that you can bolster where you stand relative to that counterpart with regard to each of these three sources of leverage, you're going to have more power and ultimately greater success in your negotiation. So how might we do that? Well, the natural way to increase your positive leverage is to identify your counterpart's interests and priorities, and to find ways in which you might address them. For example, some of the most successful job candidates are those who are able to identify things the company might want or need, and that the candidate can satisfy, but were not in the initial job description. By identifying these additional interests and making clear that the candidate can fulfill them, the candidate has meaningfully boosted his or her positive leverage in the negotiation. And sometimes this can be meaningful enough for the negotiation to move beyond the matter of whether the candidate can fill the initial job description to a conversation about whether an entirely new position might be created to leverage the additional things the candidate can bring to the table. Increasing one's negative leverage, in contrast, typically involves the use of threats. Sometimes these threats are more implicit, such as when a negotiator makes more of an oblique reference to having a good BATNA, and thus implies that he or she is quite willing to walk away from the current negotiation. However, there are other times when threats can be made much more explicitly. Of course, we can all recognize that the use of threats can be a very dangerous way of dealing with bargaining and conflict situations. They entail a very real risk of damaging the relationship and the counterpart's willingness to continue working with us. However, the reality is that they are used, particularly in contentious negotiations, and this can be for good reason. Thus, we will need a better understanding of what constitutes a threat, as well as when and why they might be important in negotiation, and we will get to that just a bit later. Finally, increasing normative leverage involves engaging in a systematic effort to identify the various laws, rules, standards, and other objective criteria that may support what you hope to achieve in the negotiation. Moreover, because there are often multiple objective criteria that are likely to pertain to any given situation, the task of bolstering normative leverage also involves finding ways to bolster the legitimacy of the objective criteria you prefer to use, and diminishing the legitimacy of the objective criteria your counterpart might prefer. This can involve leveraging the availability bias by bringing written laws, contracts, or statutes to the bargaining table to make them more salient and impactful. Or one might leverage the authority principle by finding an expert who might support the validity of the objective criteria you intend to use. In fact, this matter of increasing the perceived legitimacy of your claims applies more broadly across these three types of leverage as well. And this becomes increasingly important to the extent that you have an advantage on some of these sources of leverage, but not others. When that is the case, it is important to recognize that the perception of power is not based on an equal weighting of all three types of leverage, but rather on which type of leverage is garnering most of the attention. This means that part of your task as a negotiator is to shift the focus of attention away from the types of leverage where you are at a disadvantage and onto the types of leverage where you have an advantage. In other words, what you should be doing in the negotiation is taking note of what kind of conversation you and your counterpart are having. Are you two discussing how to satisfy each other's interests and thus focusing on positive leverage? Are you threatening one another in an attempt to use negative leverage? Or are you each making references to objective criteria in an attempt to bolster your normative leverage? And would that mode of conversation help you achieve your goals? If not, it is important to consider shifting the mode of conversation to a type of leverage where you have more of an advantage. This strategy is nicely illustrated by the 1977 Hanafi hostage negotiation that was described in Richard Schell's book, Bargaining for Advantage. When the hostages were taken and their lives threatened, the police hostage negotiators didn't push back by saying, "We don't think you have the guts to kill these hostages, and if you do, we will just kill all of you in return." The hostage takers clearly had an advantage in terms of negative leverage, so this was something the hostage negotiators did not try to dispute. Instead, what they sought to do was shift the focus of conversation to what the hostage takers might need and want. What kinds of interests did these hostage takers have that could be satisfied? In other words, what can the hostage negotiators do to increase their positive leverage? And how might the satisfaction of some of these interests allow the hostage negotiators to bolster their normative leverage? For example, it is routine practice for hostage negotiators to offer things like food, water, and medical care, and then ask for the hostage takers to acknowledge that gesture by releasing a hostage in return. This is an attempt to increase the hostage negotiators' positive leverage, as well as their normative leverage through the reciprocity principle. Likewise, hostage negotiators often start by asking for the release of injured hostages who need medical attention, and may thus be more of a liability to the hostage takers because they want to make the initial release of hostages easier and get a pattern of hostage releases started. And this is an attempt by hostage negotiators to increase normative leverage by applying the commitment and consistency principle. Moreover, hostage negotiators recognize that hostage takers' willingness to use negative leverage by killing their hostages and subsequently dying in a blaze of glory tends to decrease over time, as the adrenaline the hostage takers mustered to start the crisis starts to dissipate and the prospect of their own violent death starts to get stale. Thus, by keeping the conversation going, hostage negotiators are able to gradually shift the focus away from this negative leverage to the kinds of positive and normative leverage through which hostage negotiators can achieve better ends.